Okay, so I've been watching a bit of stuff about the ultra orthodox and the Satmar community and all that sort of stuff, and how they came to a point where they're so ultra orthodox. And one of them, it was a commentary, and one sort of said it was a reaction to the Holocaust. But what are your thoughts on that? And like, can you sort of blame them for going so ultra orthodox as far as like if they view it as a punishment from God, like the Holocaust, or?
This had nothing to do with the Holocaust. Rebbes predated the Holocaust. I mean, even the Munkacher Rebbe had made a famous appearance, I believe, in the 30s in America, and they look just like Satmar looks today.
Can you kind of blame them for being so ultra orthodox? Like seeing that like I think the mentality is that if we are not ultra orthodox, then God will punish us like the Holocaust.
It's like almost like, you know what, if they're going to kill us for being Jewish, if we're secular, let's just put on the big black hat anyway.
I'm not familiar with any of those two approaches. I just never heard them before, that the reason people are ultra religious is because God is going to punish. It's just, I think within every movement, there's an ascetic streak. Even in the Torah allows for people known as the Nazir. I think the whole role of a Nazirite is for someone who wants to feel overly pious, who wants to do extra. But it seems like the Torah requires them to bring a sacrifice, kind of bring them down to earth, to say like, look, you're so religious that you're sinning because you're not able to drink wine during Passover. You're not able to.
That's kind of like what the ultra orthodox community are doing. Like they've gone so right wing or so conservative that it's almost to their detriment. Like they're actually now breaking Torah. Like, you know.
Yeah, I think they're oblivious to that fact. That's the thing. I don't think they're comparing that to normative Torah observance. They believe that's the only way to keep Torah. They believe Moses wore a black hat.
But, you know, like the statistics of rape in the black hat community is so high. Like, you know, and they cover it up. And, like, you know, why don't
of
they
rape?
The book? Yeah, I heard the statistic, and I can't remember what it was, but rape for children, like in the black hat community, is just so high. I think it was like 1 in 5. I don't know. I don't know what it was. But it was
I'm
really
not
high.
familiar with. I mean, I know in New York, there's Nachum Rosenberg. He goes around exposing pedophilia in the Orthodox community. I don't know how high it is. I don't live in New York. I live in South Florida. There's a lot of Jews here, but
it's just an interesting community. I just, you know, it's a shame that they don't take the rational approach and they don't. You know, I don't know, do what we do, I guess.
The way I define modern orthodoxy is doing what's required and considering what's optional. I don't have my own synagogue now anymore. I mean, I daven in the Young Israel. I do what they do. I hold by this eruv, as problematic as that may be according to halacha. I try to be normal. I try to, you know, my kids go to regular Orthodox schools and they dress like their friends do. Fine. I think that these people, not just in Judaism, even in Islam, people who are fanatical, I think they're oblivious to anything else. They don't think that they're doing more. They're thinking that this is what needs to be done. This is Judaism, especially if you're born into that world. But we'd have to be assuming that they're all Baal Teshuvas who are choosing to do this. The vast majority of ultra-Orthodox Jews were born into that world. They don't know anything different. There's a show that just came out on Netflix called Unorthodox. I don't know too much of the Hasidic world. I spent time in Kiryas Joel. I met the Satmar Rebbe. I spent time in the Haredi Welt, enough to think that show was pretty accurate. Right? But other people tell me it wasn't. Fine. All right, next.
Oh, I just wanted to comment on his question. I was watching the From Reporter's videos, and he really answered that, where these Rebbe's pretty much had to fix their communities in the easiest way possible because the people, I guess, were uneducated, and they had a bunch of strange beliefs, like with amulets and things of that nature. So he kind of mixed it with this mystical touch and made it the Judaism more, I guess, appealing to the masses, as opposed to like these very educated men who were, I guess, the rabbis of the time, who kind of just weren't in touch with it. That's kind of the feeling I got from what he was explaining.
You're talking about the Baal Shem Tov, right?
Yeah, I think the Baal Shem Tov and some of these mystics that would go around and give the blessings and do these different things. At least this is what my understanding of what he was saying was. And so it kind of crept into the teachings where he kind of made it more vibrant and I think and it just kept evolving with the more like these different lines of rebbes.
Right.
I don't know if that's true.
That's the foundation of the Hasidic movement. That's really Judaism's first outreach program. The Baal Shem Tov was there to make Jews proud of being Jewish again. Jews who weren't very knowledgeable about Judaism, the peasants, initially, from what I've heard, it didn't resemble what Hasidim do nowadays. This is why the Vilna Gaon put them on Cherem. He excommunicated them. There's a book called Hasidim and Its Opponents that speaks about Hasidim in the time of the Baal Shem Tov, how they would pray standing on their heads and they'd be doing cartwheels in the synagogue. It was different, but supposedly the Cherem, the excommunication, mellowed them down a little bit. I'm not a Hasid, so I can't speak too much about the series. I don't know too much about it.
I have a pretty controversial statement.
A statement or question?
Well, it's more of a statement because, you know, you kind of threw a bunch of stuff with the Rambam out there with the books.
Oh, boy.
So I was like, okay, let me check out the Guide for the Perplexed. And I didn't have any problem with it until I think I forget the statement, but it was pretty racist.
So in the statement, he mentions Kushim, blacks, but in the same sentence, he also mentions Turks. He's speaking about certain groups of people who, one, shouldn't waste trying to educate because they can't grasp the concepts of monotheism or things that they're just not privy to. And he mentions blacks, but he also mentions Turks. Now, Turks, he doesn't say blacks, he says Ethiopians. I believe Kush is a part of Ethiopia, including Sudan. He also mentions Turks. So he's clearly speaking about culture and not race, because Turks aren't black. Appreciate these people for what they bring to the table, but that doesn't mean we agree with everything they believe. The Rambam says that one should only let his wife out of the house twice a month. He endorses slapping your wife around a little bit. Only because the Rambam says something doesn't mean it's true. So we don't listen to rabbis because of who they are, but of what they're bringing to the table. And in case of the Rambam, that what appears in Mor Nevuchim you could pretty much throw away if you wanted to, because it's his opinion. It's not halacha. His great works are Mishnah Torah, Sefer Mitzvot, and his Perush HaMishnayot. That means he took the laws and he codified them. That's it. Personal opinion that you could take, you could leave. We have to appreciate people for what they bring to the table, but not agree with them 100%. Now, there's some people who will die on that mountain and say, I believe in everything the Talmud says. I believe everything a rabbi says, I believe, if he's Orthodox. That's already, you're not going to win too many fans like that. Or perhaps you don't know Judaism well enough to know all the silly statements made by rabbis. Okay, but you could respect someone without believing that they're infallible. And that's something that most people can't do. They're like, you either accept it all or you accept nothing. Right?
That's true. I mean, it was just this most brilliant work. And then you get to that part and you're like, what? How did he? But,
I don't think like Mor Nevuchim or like what Guide for Perplexed is considered his most brilliant work.
Well, I mean, some of his statements and like philosophy, his reasoning is like really, it's really good. I mean, like the way he's doing it. If you study like philosophy,
mm-hmm.
and then it's you get this one little statement in there, you're like, what? Where did he?
No, but it's not necessary. Again, he mentions Turks, but Africa is a very big place. So if you're not Sudanese or Ethiopian, then heck, I mean, he lived in Africa himself, in I guess northern Africa. All right. Yeah, I have a way out of that, like by saying that that's not what he meant, and that like we don't like deify these people just because they happen to exist. Everything they teach is not gospel. But I mean, he's only human. Yeah, he's only human. Yeah.
Rabbi, how do you make the distinction? Sorry, how do you make a distinction between Rambam's opinion and halakha?
So he has to be reiterating something in source material. The halakha only deals with what you do, not what you believe. How do you keep Shabbat? How do you keep Yom Kippur? That what are the prohibited categories of labor on Shabbat? Things you do.
But then isn't it really his own opinion of when he amalgamated all the rabbis' opinions and everything? Then isn't that his own opinion as well? Or
you could double check it yourself. It appears in the Talmud like this. There's codifications that predated the Rambam, like the Rif. His codification are found in the back of Talmud Bavlis. It's pretty much a reiteration of that Masechet, but with all the Midrashim set aside, all the Agadah set aside, and he only leaves the Halacha. This is what the Rif brought to the table. Now, the reason it's incomplete is that the Rif only did it for Talmud Bavli. He didn't do it for Talmud Yerushalmi, the Toseftot, and the Sefer, the Sefer, the Mechilta, all this stuff. Well, the Rambam did it for all of it. So being that all these codifications, also the Rosh, all these codifications are able to distinguish what's halacha from what's midrash and agadah, shows that there's a consensus of what's prescriptive versus things that are just descriptive. If something's telling you to do something, it's halacha. However, there are ambiguous halachot that contradict each other. One tells you to go right and one tells you to go left. And that's where Judaism gets a little colorful, and you're really allowed to do either one side. The Amoraim later on said, we go by this side, we go by that side. But those are rules they invented.
Is that when you have a community and they choose their own, basically their own minhag, and they
correct?
Follow
right.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Right, so there's Sephardim who do one thing and Ashkenazim who do other things. Now, there are many people who are very short-sighted who think that only what they do are correct. This is something very popular in the Sephardi world, right?
But surely there would be a right and wrong. There should surely, like, I know Rabbi David Bar Chaim, he says the pronunciation, like, I don't know, when you hear his pronunciation, it's very different to the norm. And he says, and I think he's done some lectures on it, and said this is the way that they actually say it is incorrect. So,
Well, in certain things for sure, like not in everything. But what David Bar Haimi speaks is called Temanit. So Temanit is more like of a Judeo-Arabic. Like you use the guttural sounds. When the tav doesn't have a dagesh, do the th, like while like Ashkenazim do the sa, like Shabbos. What Yemenites will say Shabbat, Sephardim will say Shabbat. The only reason people elevate Yemenite pronunciation is because it's the oldest that we know of. But that doesn't mean that they were correct. Tanakh basically lays down the idea that every shevet, every tribe had their own pronunciation of Hebrew. This is the whole notion of Shibboleth. There's a story, I can't remember, I think it's in Kings, when the tribes are warring against each other, in one way they would find out what tribe you belong in is by making you say the word Shibboleth, because one tribe pronounced the shin like a sin. Also, Jews in Lithuanian Jews never said Shabbat, but they said Sabbat. They would pronounce the shin like a samech or a shin like a sin. So there's technically no exact way of pronouncing it, but just the oldest that we happen to know of is the Yemenite pronunciation, and it aligns the most with things that appear in the Talmud. For example, it says in the Talmud, you're supposed to elongate the dalid in echad. That when you say the Shema, echad. That's what Ashkenazim do. While the Temani pronunciation of the Dalet in that instance, I believe without a dagesh, it's almost like a th, but a dth. So it's a had. So you're able to actually elongate it. So there's hints in the Talmud itself to point to the fact that Yemenite Jews have the more correct pronunciation. Fine. I'm not big on pronunciations. I do Ashkenazi, Yemenite, Sephardi, or like Mizrahi pronunciation. It's not so important to me. Going back to the Rambam then, as far as like, it's just interesting how he's amalgamated all the opinions from all the rabbis, from all the guys that wrote halakha, and now he's come to the opinion. His own opinion says, well, this is it. Now, is that, I don't know, is that something that we go by? I don't know. It's just a question. You don't have to. He was trying to do the Jewish people a favor, because the average Jew, first of all, there was no printing press back then. So if you're lucky, every big community had one Talmud. In order for you to know the law, you would have to go to a rabbi. Like he writes in its introduction to the Mishnah Torah that now that I've codified all these laws in the Mishnah Torah, you don't have to study the Talmud anymore because I have the laws already codified for you. This really took the power away from the rabbis because back then if you wanted the law, you had to go to a rabbi. But he codified his Mishnah Torah in very plain Hebrew that anyone could understand, and he just told you what the laws were, and that's it. He said, now that you have this, study this, you don't have to study the Talmud anymore. So it really was a boost for the common Jew who perhaps didn't know Aramaic, couldn't distinguish between Midrash, Agadah, and Halacha. However, the ideal is to use the same tools the Rambam used to codify his Mishnah Torah. That means that the ideal is to be able to hop into the Mishnah yourself and see what the laws are. And with the Rambam's help, now what you can do that. You could study the Mishnah Torah with a Kesef Mishnah or Magid Mishnah, a Lechem Mishnah, where that basically takes his laws and brings them back to their original source, tells you it's here in the Mishnah, it's here in the Talmud, and see how he came to his conclusion. But there are things in Mishnah Torah that are just his opinion. He gives advice on health. He says that it's unhealthy to eat fruit. He says a lot of things that aren't applicable nowadays. And it appears like halacha aleph, halacha bet, but it's not necessarily a halacha. So even when studying the Rambam, you have to have a little bit of knowledge between what's a halacha and not, because he brings down midrashim also. In Hilchos Melachim, he talks about how 6 laws were supposedly given to Adam and the 7th law was given to Noah to give a basis for the 7 Noahide laws. If you want to grow, you still have to know something when coming to the Rambam. He is more of a help, but you could skip all that and go straight to the Mishnah. It's going to be hard to live in a Jewish community and have your kids marry other Jewish kids without doing all the customary things in the Jewish world that have been added in later on. Halakha is not that diverse. It's not that burdensome if it's taken straight from the Mishnah. And this is what they did when there was a temple. This is what they did when they had a court. This is what they would put people to death by, what appears in the Mishnah. Not later on. The opinions of the Amoraim were never adjudicated in the Sanhedrin because the Amoraim didn't have smicha. There was no court at the time of Amoraim. The Amoraim are the rabbis that appear in the Gemara. The Talmud is a combination of both the Mishnah and the Gemara. So the Gemara is the commentary to the Mishnah. If you want to get deeper, the Mishnah is almost slightly a commentary to the Braitot, because a Tana is called a Tana because he was someone who would quote Braitot by memory. And with the Amoraim were people who would quote the words of the time. So it's almost like one quoting the other. Nowadays, it's been almost established that the Mishnah is the source. But, I mean, there's things that predated the Mishnah that's still considered Mishnaic. I mean, these people, they had smicha. The rabbis in the Talmud had smicha. The rabbis in the Braitot and the Toseftot, which are Toseftot are also Braitot. They're the Braitot that are halachically binding. They all had smicha, but the Amoraim didn't have smicha. So that means that they just comment, and anything the Amoraim bring to the table are really disposable. But this is kind of shocking. This will really turn the world of most rabbis upside down if they ever chose to think far deep into the rabbit hole. I mean, there's only a handful of rabbis who do this. Rabbi David Bar Chaim is one of them, slightly, and Rabbi Chaim Ovadia is another that I know of. Maybe Rabbi Joseph Or, maybe. For example, like my latest video on why people shouldn't get drunk on Purim, I took it down straight to the Mishnah this time. I made a video about 5 years ago on why, according to the Rambam, he didn't mean that people should get drunk. But I skipped the Rambam, I skipped the Gemara, and I went back to the Mishnah this time. And I mentioned that the reason people shouldn't get drunk on Purim is because the Mishnah doesn't mention it. The notion of getting drunk on Purim was invented by Amoraim. People never mention this. That means that Rabbi Akiva didn't get drunk on Purim. Hillel didn't get drunk on Purim. You know, people who didn't exist in the time of the Gemara wouldn't have known the stories that Amoraim would have brought to the table. And it's an Amara that brings a story of Rav Zera, Shechting Rabbah, and this and that. This is not in the Mishnah. But for some reason, people still walk around thinking they have some obligation to get drunk on Purim.